Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the annual conference of the Center for Humanitarian Action, here live from Berlin. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the CHA, or CHA, and we are really happy to have you back on our second day of the conference. After a long day yesterday where we discussed the Triple Nexus in practice, what about peace? These two issues have been at the heart of the very first day, with panels on what it means in practice, with many practitioners joining us. And what about peace? Defining what we mean by peace, what could be meant by peace in conceptual terms, but also program-wise. And we touched at the very end of this day on a key topic which keeps being discussed, raised, also from your side, which is donor policies. Yesterday afternoon, we concluded with a quick session, one of our spotlight sessions on especially German donor policies. And we'd like to pick up from there with two sessions right now, starting this very morning. And we are really happy to have great guests on this one. Let me quickly introduce you why do we focus on that. What we shared with you yesterday was also a survey we've done in the run-up of the conference. And in this survey, two key issues have been named, how to deal with the Triple Nexus and how to implement it, because most of you said, both in the conference yesterday as in the survey, it is an important issue. Most participants in the survey said they want their employers, their aid agencies, to engage in a Triple Nexus, but there is a key challenge. What does it mean in practice? So not really having a clue how to do it. Plus, number two, donor policies. Donors have been a driving force in the Triple Humanitarian Nexus in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit 2016. But at the same time, they are sometimes discussed as living not really up to their own words, not really implementing what they ask others to do in a more integrated way in the humanitarian development and peace worlds. So we are really happy that we can discuss these two issues this morning with great guests, and we will start with a keynote dialogue focusing on the German setting, and move on then to a session with guests from ECHO, from the European level, with practitioners, and then move on also to the peace angle and the development side represented by the German Development Ministry. But right now, I'm really happy to welcome our first guest for our keynote dialogue, which is Frau Bärbel Kofler. Bärbel Kofler is the Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Assistance of the Federal German Government, and I hope she's already with us and we can welcome her and see her, everybody, in a second. And we are really proud to have this dialogue this morning with such an influential and already for years dealing with this topic guest as a guest of honor for the second day. When introducing Bärbel Kofler, good morning, Frau Kofler. Can you hear me and see us?
I hear you perfectly. Good morning.
Thank you. And thank you for having a nice logo in the background as well. So.
Yes, sure. That's for all our meetings now is the logo in the background.
All right. Many thanks for joining us, Frau Kofler. Looking at your CV last night, I was really impressed, and if you don't mind, I pick something up which maybe is not every time shared. In 1987, you did an advanced technical college degree based on a secondary educational path. Only a few years later, you did already studies on computer science, starting in 1987, when I wasn't even aware that there was an internet out there. Followed by language studies of Russian and Spanish in Salzburg, so you learned Austrian at the same time, which can be a challenge, concluding in 1998 with a PhD. So within 10 years, you've done all that, while most of my friends haven't concluded their PhD in 10 years. So we are impressed by that. So I may also mention that you've been a member of parliament since 2004, and you are the Commissioner of the Federal Government for 4 years now. Frau Kofler, given your background and in this era when we all could travel at least a bit, we heard the last days, yesterday, last sessions, a lot about stats, about concepts of the Triple Nexus. Given your vast experience in the era, maybe we start on this early morning on the personal note. Is there any anecdote, any story you would like to share when you realized things are changing? The root causes of crisis are moving from the traditional natural disaster. There's an earthquake and humanitarian assistance needs to be provided really quickly to move into this conflict zone, to be explained and for you really illustrative. Why is 80% of humanitarian assistance today needed in conflict settings? Is there any small story you would like to share as a start?
Sure, I could. One of the first trips I did as a commissioner was to Ethiopia, and it was basically framed, the whole trip was on a food crisis driven by natural catastrophes, extreme weather phenomena, and then the bad harvest situation in the area. But when you're really on the ground, you realize it's not only, in quotation marks, not only the natural catastrophe, it's a nexus in between peace questions. There were so many refugees I've met in a situation of unstable food security. It was the situation of peace in between neighboring countries, Eritrea and Ethiopia, and the humanitarian crisis also for the refugees, in concurrence to the people living on the ground who had then a development issue because they had to change their whole way of living, which wasn't sustainable anymore for future generations. So it was the whole nexus in between peace building, humanitarian assistance, which is needed on the ground at the first hand, and ideas on development where society could go to establish a sustainable basis on living, making a living. And for me, that was in a few days, that was all three types of the nexus question were there, so obvious. So it's clear that all has to be somehow interlinked. And if you talk to the people on the ground, you see that you can't make the difference so clearly.
Thank you. An impressive example, I believe, especially given that Ethiopia is at the heart of many of us, given the past decades and the story, how to deal with the crisis in Ethiopia, which are so much interlinked, as you just highlighted. We've shown yesterday how today, 5 years later, since your trip, I guess, humanitarian needs have been booming even further. We showed how the number of conflicts have increased and how this is interlinked. At the same time, again, when you started as a commissioner, the World Humanitarian Summit was taking place in 2016, and there was a grand bargain when governments as well as aid practitioners committed to implement a sort of triple nexus, whatever that might mean, to focus more on the conflict side, to focus more on the peace leg. If you would need to put in a nutshell, how has the German government dealt with it? What has been the follow-up in concrete terms, like putting it in a 2-3 minute nutshell for somebody who isn't really an expert on that? How would you frame that?
2-3 minutes is a challenge. That's one of the big problems. No, well, I've been to the summit in Istanbul in 2016, and it was for us as German government always a very, very important moment, focusing on the Great Bargain, to support on the first hand collecting money, to have money in advance also, to maybe hinder that conflicts grow or that humanitarian needs are growing. So we try to concentrate on this forecast question also. Then it's a question. It's the question on stabilizations on areas. We have a department here in our foreign ministry concentrating on the question of stabilization. Mediation, conflict mediation is a big topic. Building up structures in countries that might even be administrative structures, so that there is some framework where you really can start then for humanitarian action and for development action then is very important for us. And what we also learned is, of course, that while the development in the last few years, unfortunately, is going in the other direction. So when I started as Commission on Humanitarian Assistance, we were talking about a need about $20 billion for humanitarian assistance. Now it's doubled. If we see the real figures now, conflicts like mushrooms in all angles of the world are increasing. Frozen conflicts are getting hot conflicts again. So the need is more than maybe we focused in the last time on really concentrating on mediation, on peace processes, international peace processes, and to see that I think 2/3 is the figure of all the humanitarian needs are driven by those conflicts. So yeah, we try to do that with stabilisation, humanitarian assistance here in the Foreign Ministry, and with our BMZ on the other hand, to fulfill all three needs. But it's a challenge, and as the world community, I think we have to get better in that.
Mm-hmm. You named already that it's a challenge, and maybe before we dive into two main areas to go into a bit further analysis on the latest steps, let me remind you, please participate. You can engage in the chat on Zoom, on YouTube if are registered, or on Twitter with a live tweet, and join us. We will have a couple of minutes at the very end of this talk as well, but please be fast so our colleagues have a chance to collect your questions and to raise them in a few minutes with us here and on TV. Frau Kofler, maybe we look into two ways into the subject. I mean, for one, there's the level of the programming, the integrated programs. A lot of talk about how can we better, if appropriate, link humanitarian development and peace efforts. And on the other hand, there's this level of integration of policies, sometimes with very contradicting views, because there's a lot of talk, why don't we integrate better some of the programs named, while on the policy side, often it's rather the issue raised, should we integrate policies? Like you named already stabilization, there is security policies, and there is a lot of discussion, what does peace actually mean, and what's the difference between peace policies versus security policies? So maybe, if you don't mind, if we start with the program side. Yesterday in our spotlight session, we discussed already briefly the program side and German approaches to deal with it, like the so-called chapeau approach to link transitional assistance from the development ministry with the humanitarian side based in the Foreign Office. We talked a bit about the pilots, the pilot countries the Foreign Office has also named. So if you would need to summarize a bit on this program, on this practical side, how the record funding Germany is impressively providing, 2.1 billion euro by the end of this year, how this is implemented in a way which is more nexus-driven than 5 years ago.
It has to be more nexus-driven because it's not only the 2.1 billion in the humanitarian and stabilization sector and the Foreign Office. We have also an increasingly amount of money on the development side. So we need to coordinate that more because otherwise it wouldn't be really an effective question. And maybe you talked about it yesterday already, but what we now do is a joint analyze and aligned planning in the two ministries to really adjust the money and the action, the projects in the way it's been needed. It's the so-called GAP, it's GAP, it's if you translate it to English, it's joint analysis and aligned planning. So that's something which really changed in this field of politics since years by now, and I think we are really learning in planning our projects better. Maybe the colleagues yesterday were pointing out this example. That's a 1-year-old example, so of course we need to do a follow-up in the next years also. From 2019 in Lebanon, where we have humanitarian action in the health sector. and do it in a joint planning to widen the possibilities of health centers also in rural area, for example, a clearly development issue. And doing that, of course, in a part of the world where the question of peace is a kind of overarching question, and trying to bring together those three things. That's one of the examples. Or the so-called, you were mentioning chapeau, projects. One is in Somalia. We do that also with NGOs together, because that's important to bring different donors with different ministries on a planning line, which is then focusing really in humanitarian action and in midterm support and in development support. So Somalia is one example where we do that with the two ministries, and I think it's Save the Children, quite an interesting project. So, but that's new. It's new. It's we have to admit it's new, and it's developing the last years. And we also have to see, of course, how the effects are, what we can learn of the out of the pilot projects, and how we can get better. And then doing a permanent evaluation and trying to get better in all our approaches.
Thank you for that. If we look at our analysis, both of 8 programs, of 8 agencies themselves, and on government policies, not necessarily only the German ones, it seems to be striking that even if you look only at the Humanitarian Development Nexus, we talk so much about already for many years, progress has been very limited and pretty much is still in silos. And now on top we have this peace issue with all these challenges coming with it. Would you agree that maybe most actors, including donors and maybe including the German government, are overstretched by the Triple Nexus so far?
I don't know if it's overstretched, but of course everybody is used to do things. They did it always. And then we are in a totally new situation. If we look only on the amount of money we are investing in humanitarian and stabilization, you pointed out the 2.1 billion this year. That's 5 times more since the last 5 years when I started my office. So you have to, of course, invest more in really effective, appropriate, invest that money. But frankly speaking, we didn't 5 times raise our people who are doing that on the ground then. So we have to rethink a lot of how we do things, and this joint planning, joint analysis is one of the questions. What we done a long time already is the whole debate on institutional building, mediation in between conflict parties. So that was always an important part of our policy in the foreign ministry. But yes, we have to get those aspects closer together. But we are willing to do so, and we already started that. So that's for us very important.
Right. Thank you. Maybe we move to the second topic on the policy side, on the policy structures and the concepts involved in that. If we have a situation that on the program side, there is a lot of piloting still ongoing, it's a lot about the dual nexus on humanitarian development challenges on all fronts by all actors, and now we have the peace leg coming into play. One might think it's the more important to have a common definition and concept of peace, and what do we mean by peace, and to have a clear-cut institutional setup to deal with it. You mentioned already stabilization policies, which is a very interesting setup in the Foreign Office, for example, in Germany. Humanitarian action and assistance is part of the Department for Stabilization. Some critics say that this is blurring the lines. Sometimes the same critics who say we need a much more integrated approach, but not in this front. So on the program side, we have a discussion for more integration. On the policy side, we have rather concerns sometimes not to integrate the wrong things, the wrong tools, which should be split and separated. So if we take the example of the Division for Stabilization, in the guidelines of what stabilization means for the German government, it means focusing on crises and conflicts which impact German and European security interests. For humanitarians, that's probably a quote proving that humanitarian assistance might be integrated in a triple nexus approach into policy interests which are conflicting with impartial, neutral humanitarian assistance. How do you view that as the Commissioner for Humanitarian Assistance of the German government?
Well, I can understand the critics because, of course, coming from the background of development or humanitarian work, you have to be very, very strictly concerned that what you're mentioning, neutrality, impartiality, is one of the keys of humanitarian work. On the other hand, you have to do something to stabilize a situation and not to prolong for decades situations where you only can work with humanitarian need. You need a further setting. And without peace, we started our conversation in saying that conflicts are the biggest drivers for humanitarian needs, for hunger, for humanitarian needs. For people out of health systems, education, and so on. So we have to do something on the peace field also. Of course, if we have a stable situation in our neighboring continents, in other parts of the world, that also helps our stability in our continent, in Europe. But the main goal for humanitarians and the main goal for me as a commissioner always is the help for the people in need. And I think that is also the policy we try to follow in the ministry. And we are very much also working with institutions like the International Red Cross Red Crescent movement, who are really standing up for neutrality, for independence, for being impartial, and to support those guidelines, humanitarian guidelines we all really stick to. Our humanitarian guidelines here in the ministry, we just renewed our planning and our theoretical framework last year. And we are really concentrating on those three values, humanitarian values. But yes, I have to admit, I think that is for everybody clear. It's a challenge. Because if you go into the work of stabilization, then you have to work with somebody, and that might be part of the conflict parties then. So the question of how neutral you are focused by others then is maybe questionable. But on the other hand, without peace, you can better the humanitarian situation. So you have to do it somehow. It is not a clear white and black, and you're right, it's a kind of blurred situation. But I believe we have to work on stabilization, and part of that also can be, and maybe we should focus more on that, how mediation processes in between conflict parties can be part of a peace-building concept. So maybe there is a lot of room to still open to work in.
Right. If I hear you right, this is a bit the view that it's a question of sequencing, because for sure we all think the baseline for everything is in the first place security, in a sense. If you take the example of Mali, security might mean that in the first place you have to stop ISIS taking over the whole country and to establish a situation where there is still a state and there is still some scope to deal with the situation at all. Then you might move on, as has been the policy, with a stabilization mission, a UN mission with stabilization policies, and this might lay the foundation for long-term peace, and humanitarian action can be a part of it. Critics would say the example of Mali demonstrates that it can be very conflicting, actually, because you might focus on the short-term stabilization, on your short-term European security or even migration policies, given that it's a migration hub to Europe as well. And you might lose out on the other side. You might lose out because you have to deal with a government which tended to be fairly corrupt, not to really deal with the needs of their own population, and which has been overthrown just after protests just a few months ago. Is there a conflict by concept, sometimes at least, that in some settings it's very hard to find the right sequence, and sometimes priorities are not really rightly set?
I think it's very hard to find the right sequence, because in every conflict and every situation it can be slightly different. That's the one thing. And the other thing is, well, what could be done differently if people are not able to come to places where they can receive humanitarian assistance, where they can find nutrition, if there is not a possibility for them to reach out or for the aid workers to reach the people. So how can we then provide humanitarian assistance? So that's somehow interlinked. And we know also conflicts where nobody is looking too closely, and where you already have challenges to support people on the humanitarian side. So it's not so easy to answer that question, to be frank. But of course, then you have a situation on the ground where governments are not committed what they once promised, where there's corruption on the ground, where there is undemocratic situations where people are not heard. So you have to deal with that every day again, and in every conflict again.
Thank you. Maybe sharing only quickly one final example where leaving Mali last year and moving on to South Sudan on our Triple Nexus research. It has been really interesting to see there that there has been a local request and local potential and even local capacities to implement a Triple Nexus to deal with peace in an integrated way. But at the same time, for example, there the international community, including the German team, has been really limited, and engagement has been pretty limited. So maybe sometimes to focus on the countries where there is real potential to move on, and really a local request by the affected people themselves could help. Maybe for now a final word from your side before we ask if something is ongoing in the chat, which can be challenging in these quick talks because people tend to listen first and then engage, which makes sense. But maybe if we sum up that in the international debate there is often a donor paradox identified, meaning we have the donors promoting a triple nexus, asking agencies, asking people on the ground to integrate more, to think more beyond the silos, to integrate humanitarian action, even if there are substantial risks involved, to really engage with the development humanitarian peace world. Is there a donor paradox because the very same donors, talking about the international ones as well, are not really living up to this on their own? They stick to their silos but ask others to move on?
Yeah, that might be. I think we are all too much driven in our used ideas, or in our silos, if you would call it like that. But what you mentioned before with the example of South Sudan, I think is quite interesting. We should really, that's part of our humanitarian plan we developed last year. We should listen more what's really going on the ground. Localization is a big issue, I think. And then the question on to use maybe those windows of opportunity which are there at a certain moment, that is very important. And for that, it leads to a topic which I think we should think more is on forecasting, on forecast-based financing. That's, of course, on the field of natural catastrophe, that's easier. But if you have a good view on how windows of opportunity also in the conflict sense are opening, and you get a little bit of more feeling that could, if that is happening, we should now act and can come in with humanitarian stabilization, peace-building processes, we can get quicker. And that's also something we can learn from those examples you were given with South Sudan.
Many thanks. Indeed, South Sudan has been impressive. I met there every single German soldier of the UN mission because there are only 13.
Not so much.
And I met every single employee, German employee of the embassy, because there are only 2. So that's gives us a sense how engagement is maybe driven times by other issues. Let me share now with you what my colleague Darina, a research fellow at the Center for Humanitarian Action, has cited in the chat, if any. We have only a few minutes left, but if we can raise one or two questions for you, Frau Kofler, and then come to a final question from my side, I think that would be a nice summing up. Over to you, Darina.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ralf. Well, the chat has been very lively despite it's very early in the morning. So thank you very much to the online audience. Unfortunately, time is running out already, so I'm afraid I have to pick and choose. So my apologies for every questions I could not pick up here. So I would like to pose 3 to you, and maybe you can select which one you want to prioritize. One is about the stabilization and the humanitarian principles. Markus Geisser says that, well, the German aid strategy from 2019 puts a strong emphasis on the primacy of principled humanitarian action. And with this in mind, he is asking, from a German experience, stabilization and the humanitarian principles, is that not an odd couple? What are the challenges? Is it an impossible, what he calls spagat, which splits, which would meaning splitting in English? So that would be the first question. The second one is about the importance of the policy position, which is put forward by Patrick Kamadi from Humedica, and he is saying that the converging role of the diplomacy and negotiation in humanitarian development and peace fora is of course crucial. But this is one area where Germany's position can help a lot. So his fear is, however, that Germany is seen now more like a HDP Nexus cash cow. Post the World Humanitarian Summit and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, he sees that diplomacy and the negotiation role will nevertheless be very important. So is there any views and comments on that? And finally, one last question on localization. The experience of Barbara Anne Kingsman shows that discussions in the capitals and the commitments made by different capitals is not exactly met by the same understanding and same approach in the several embassies in the countries. This makes it difficult to have a strategic discussion on the country level, and maybe we can hear some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Darina. Frau Kofler, maybe I can sum up 2 of them and link it to your final word on the outlook.
Sure.
We discussed the stabilization issue, I believe, but maybe it's also time to switch tables and give you a chance how you see other actors, as we tend to talk so much about donors, other actors and how they might see the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus rather as a cash cow and rather as an opportunity to relabel and to fundraise. Is that an issue you would confirm from your experience? Plus, this interesting question on a split between the headquarter level and the local level, the embassy level, if you might want to talk about the local level, but the headquarter, the embassy level, let alone the local level of the affected people themselves. Is there a disconnect which might be a key issue?
Oh my God, and that's in a few final words. I should conclude all that. That's a little bit of a challenge. Well, starting with the cash cow question, and the question was also, I think, if we in Germany think that we'll become the cash cow somehow after latest developments. I don't think so. But one thing is what we are working on, and that's something maybe I want to point out at the end. 80% of all the humanitarian assistance is given by 10 donors. So if you see how challenging the conflicts are, how many need there is on the ground, we have, of course, the one thing we debated in Istanbul at the World Humanitarian Summit, to use the money really effectively and use it the best way. That's why I mentioned the question on focus-based financing, because that's one of the strategies to really use the money better. And there might not everybody be happy, because also used ways of receiving money and so on are then questioned. That's maybe an interesting debate. On the other hand, we have to see us more as a world community where not only 10 donors are the ones who are financing mainly the humanitarian system. So we have to have an outreach on other areas in the world, other countries. We have to integrate that, and that is also a political challenge, because that's then mainly not only countries with a democratic base, let's put it that way, and we have to see how that is working then in a political framework. But that is one of the big issues, because otherwise we won't fill the gap in between what's going on the ground, the needs, and the money from the capital, and following that, of course, also the decisions in the capital. Because one of the differences, I'm sure, between our members also of the embassies on the ground is they see the need very closely every day. And of course, you don't do that in the capital if you only read the reports of the embassies. We take that very seriously and try to get those two sides together. But if you see the need on the ground every day, you probably have a different approach, what is needed. And that has to be brought together financially and with the capacity of people whom we send to do the work on the ground. So to bring that together still is a challenge. This whole aspect on Nexus, on humanitarian assistance as a whole, is a work in progress and is a challenge all the time. And we have to do a lot of formats like yours and your annual meeting to get better and to learn from that experience. So that's maybe my last word is this whole question on humanitarian assistance is always a process, how we can get better.
Thank you so much, Frau Kofler. It is a process. Next year, the process of the World Humanitarian Summit will have its 5th anniversary. For one, we hope we can see you then again and maybe have a lively discussion about humanitarian policies overall. And we hope then we can share better news and talk about if there is a chance to reverse trends on the humanitarian and on the conflict and peace building side. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. It has been a real pleasure. Talk to you soon again. Thank you.
Pleasure was on my side. Have a good conference. All the best to you.
Thank you. With this, I'd like to give us a break of maybe 60 seconds. We will move on straight to the next panel, which will focus on the very same donor policies. We will look at European policies, German peace policies, and we have real experts and practitioners with us. Stay tuned. In 30 seconds, we might be back. Thank you.